AM Agenda with Kieran Gilbert.
Now here on AM Agenda, I'm joined by the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer, Steve Ciobo, and the Shadow Immigration Minister, Richard Marles. Gentlemen, good morning. Richard, to you on this UN push by Australia and the United States, agreed to at Osmin for an international response to these foreign jihadis, about 60 according to our intelligence agencies from Australia. How much sort of impact can that have?
Well, this is a really terrible international situation, and it's going to require an international response which is coordinated. So I do think this is the right step forward. And, you know, obviously, as the opposition, we want to see details, but our disposition is very much to be supporting the government in its working with the United States to deal with this issue. I mean, I agree with the Prime Minister, to be honest. I think that image of the young boy holding the severed head is about as disturbing an image as I think I've seen. And if you think about what we've all experienced globally over the last 20 years, that's not a small statement to make, but I still make it. It is absolutely terrible, and it's hard to imagine that the people that we're talking about going to Syria from Australia have grown up watching the same TV as you and I have, experiencing the same culture here in Australia that we have, and it's an issue that absolutely needs to be dealt with, and our disposition is very much to work with the government to deal with it.
And I guess that goes to Richard Marles, that would go to intelligence frameworks and so on internationally, but already we have very close ties with the US and the Five Eyes as it's known.
Well, that's right. I mean, our relationship with the United States is, of course, really the most important bilateral relationship that we have. We work very closely with the US in all matters defence, but as you say, in terms of intelligence as well. I was in the US a couple of weeks ago, and it's clear that the relationship is as strong as ever, and it's one which absolutely transcends political boundaries, both here and in the United States. And this is a time where we need to be working really closely with the US, because I think the emergence of ISIS, what we're seeing play out in Iraq and Syria, is an enormous global issue, and we need to be working very closely with the United States to be able to deal with it.
Steve Ciobo, you'd welcome the bipartisanship you're hearing from Mr Marles this morning on this matter?
Look, of course, Kieran, I welcome the fact, and the government welcomes that Labor's being supportive on this. In many respects, what we're confronting now as a nation, and of course it's not only Australia, this applies to a number of Western democracies, but what we are facing is almost unprecedented. We're not talking about now a terrorist cell. We're actually talking about a terrorist army, an actual army that's focused on the development of a terrorist state, basically. I mean, this is a threat from terrorism, from clearly wicked people prepared to go to any lengths, public beheadings, reports of crucifixions, clear tactics of gross intimidation, to such an extent, and I mean, let's not forget even reports of attempted genocide. We are talking about a threat now to the world from some of the most evil people, frankly, that seem to have walked the planet, which is now presenting a clear danger, and we need to be vigilant toward it. And I'm pleased that the Labor Party is supporting the government on this.
And on the issue of the humanitarian airdrops, we've seen the US and Britain involved in that. Richard Marles, again, I want to get Labor's view on this. The Prime Minister confirming that Australia will take part in that, will provide support through some of our aircraft in the Middle East. Is that something Labor supports, given that, of course, we all know the history. Labor very much opposed the original Iraq operation. This one, the Prime Minister says, is very different. It's not geopolitical. This is all about a humanitarian response.
Well, again, we obviously want to see details, but again, our disposition is to be supporting the government in its working with the United States to deal with this humanitarian issue. I think we've all been appalled by what is playing out on the side of Mount Sinjar with the Yazidi minority. I mean, the words that Steve Ciobo just said is absolutely right in terms of the way in which ISIS are going about their business in terms of that group of people. And the world does need to be acting from a humanitarian point of view, and our disposition is very much to support that action. I mean, this is it is an unprecedented situation that we are seeing with the emergence of ISIS. In the world of terror, in a sense, which has emerged since 2001, this seems to be a new development, and we just have to be working together within our own polity in Australia, but together globally to deal with this issue, because it is ultimately going to be a threat to all of us. And one of the reasons that we were in Afghanistan was from the point of view of trying to deny Afghanistan as a place which would be a base for terrorism, a place that was a base for terrorism which inflicted so much harm on Australians through the Bali bombings. It's why we've worked with the international community in terms of Mali to stop that place being used as a base for terrorism. And it's why we need to be very much focused on ISIS in northern Iraq and Syria to make sure that that territory isn't used in the same way.
Well, this is sadly, Steve Ciobo, what it looks like is happening at the moment. And as one US analyst put it to me yesterday on this program, he says that the Middle East continues to drag the US back as they try and pivot to the Indo-Pacific, to our region, that they continually are drawn back into that fractious and unstable region.
Look, and I mean, it's unfortunately been the case, hasn't it, Kieran, that for thousands of years the Middle East has all too frequently been a focus point for conflict. I'm grateful that the United States, sometimes more, sometimes less, is a cop on the beat, so to speak, in terms of global policy. Frankly, we need to make sure that we keep curbs in place on the sometimes ridiculous ambition of some pretty evil people. And I think the fact that the United States has demonstrated, together with willing partners like Australia, for example, has demonstrated a willingness to exert some influence on an international level to try to curb some of these wicked people is appropriate. By the same token, you also see a continued focus by the West, Australia, the United States and others, to provide humanitarian relief, to provide shelter for those who seek shelter from the same wicked people that we're seeing operating now. And I just say, well, thank goodness that there is the United States and other countries like Australia who are willing to flex the muscle.
I want to look at our domestic policy response now, because with that international effort, Steve Ciobo, the government moving counter-terrorism laws that will require telcos, among other things, to hold on to metadata for at least 2 years. When a similar effort to enshrine greater powers for intelligence agencies when it comes to this issue was pursued by Julia Gillard, you said it was like returning to establishing some sort of Gestapo tactic. What do you say in response to your government's approach here, in the context of what we were discussing, some 50 or 60 jihadis that are in Iraq and Syria right now from Australia?
Well, my comments previously were in relation to Labor's ambitions, and Labor's ambitions went much further than what the Coalition has proposed. Labor was wanting to monitor the internet activities of all Australians, including all the IP addresses they were going to, their web history, so on and so forth. And you've even had ISPs like IINet indicate that that was the case in terms of Labor's previous position. What the Coalition's talking about now is quite different. You saw the Communications Minister make it clear that it's going to apply to what we call an originating IP address. So in other words, the internet account that you or I have, Kieran, and not which sites we're going to, but rather the fact that we had a particular internet account and it was in effect at a particular given time, similar to knowing that your mobile number is X or that your home phone number is Y. I'm much more relaxed about that because it's not mass surveillance, and ultimately this is going to be a powerful arsenal for the government to know those people and be able to keep track on those people that might be trying to do things by the wrong thing by other Australians.
As reported in Fairfax today, and at the time, July the party room meeting in which you and Scott Ryan both expressed concerns about metadata retention. Have those concerns now been allayed?
Well, I want to see the detail, but based on the information that's been put out in the public domain, I'm comfortable with it. And look, ultimately, I'm also a member of the executive, and so I support the decision of the cabinet. But ultimately, you know, I'm someone, in history demonstrates this, Kieran, I'm someone who fiercely believes in the supremacy of the individual over the state and that there should be limits on state power. I make no apologies for that. I've always held that point of view. But in relation to metadata, I think the government has got the balance right. There are safeguards in place. And let's not forget that there is a very real and clear danger that exists in the community at the moment, where we've got what would otherwise seem to be innocuous and otherwise peaceful Australians suddenly doing the most horrendous, evil, wicked things. And frankly, we need to throw the book at these people, and they should be confined. One, if they're overseas, they shouldn't be allowed back into Australia. But two, if we know they're here, as far as I'm concerned, for the safety of the community, these people need to be put under lock and key.
Richard Marles, I want to get your thoughts on this, because intelligence the sources have told me that they don't see this as any great change to what they have at the moment in terms of their powers, that it's simply establishing and getting the telcos to do what they've done, and that is to hold these records for 2 years. So in that context, does Labor support maintaining what is basically the status quo?
Well, in terms of what Steve has just said, whatever the Communications Minister made clear, the Attorney-General certainly did not. I mean, frankly, the government has got no idea what it's trying to do or even how to explain it to the Australian public. And when you look at the train wreck of an interview that George Brandis did last week, that says it all in terms of the government's own understanding about its own policy. The point that you made in the introduction with your question is in essence right. The whole question around metadata is about hanging on to information which is currently collected, but technological advances and different ways in which people will be billed in the future mean that telcos may not need, from their own point of view, to keep that data. So we get the issue. It's actually the same response on this issue as it has been on the other issues we've been talking about today. We're dealing with national security here. Our disposition is to work with the government and to support them. But having said that, you know, we want to see the detail. We want to understand exactly what the government's doing. And in circumstances where the government doesn't even know how to articulate it themselves, it's very hard to come forward and say we agree with every proposition they're putting forward.
I thought Steve Ciobo did all right this morning, but anyway, that's another point. We'll get back to the budget after the break. Stay with us on AM Agenda. This is AM Agenda. Thanks for your company with me this morning, Richard Marles and Steve Ciobo. Your Treasurer last night had talks with Clive Palmer. Steve Ciobo, from what Mr Palmer's saying this morning, no sign of budging just yet on the budget.
Well, look, I mean, the fundamental problem with the budget is that the Labor Party continues to be obstructionist. Only the Coalition has a clear plan, an economic action strategy to get Australia back on track and to have Australia start to live within its means. The simple fact is, Kieran, that if the Labor Party did the responsible thing, if the Labor Party actually not only stood by good economic governance for Australia, but I would simply ask for the Labor Party to actually support their own policies and their own announced savings rather than doing what they're doing currently, which is the opposite.
What about the paid parental leave? Is the Prime Minister, more to the point, finally going to amend that so that it's more in line with the rest of your budget message?
Well, look, the paid parental leave scheme, which, by the way, we've taken to 2 elections, the paid parental leave scheme starts 1 July next year. In what shape and form that will be, I guess we'll see. It's obviously got to get the support of the Parliament, in particular the Upper House, but we've taken it to 2 elections, Kieran. It starts 1 July next year, and we remain committed to it.
Well, for the moment. And on the co-payment? Is it all about not the dollar but about the concessions, those that might be exempted from paying it? That seemed to be what your colleague Peter Dutton said yesterday.
Well, look, I think that the Health Minister, Peter Dutton, is continuing to do an outstanding job. He's got a clear vision for the future about making sure that Australia's health system is sustainable, and I contrast it again with Labor's approach, which just seems to be keep spending as much money, and it doesn't matter that we're mortgaging the next generation of Australians. Ultimately, with respect to the co-payment, again, we're having discussions with the crossbench, and we'll see ultimately what is able to be passed by the Parliament. But again, we've outlined a strategy. We've outlined a plan. All anyone else is offering is made up, frankly, on the run, ad hoc, with no sustainability, and it simply puts future generations of Australians in more debt.
It gets to a point where Labor will have to start answering some of those questions about what your alternative is, given you're blocking some of the savings, as Steve Ciobo pointed out, that you had promised in government.
Well, Kieran, the fundamental problem with this budget is that it's a dog's breakfast. We're here 3 months after the budget was delivered, and we are no closer to seeing it pass through the Parliament than we were when Joe Hockey made his first speech. And that's because this is a budget.
The bulk of the budget's gone through.
True.
No, the bulk of the budget has gone through.
This is a profoundly unfair budget. It hurts the most vulnerable in our community in terms of the GP co-payment, in terms of deregulating our universities, increasing university fees, in terms of increasing the pension. And really what needs to happen here is that the government has to swallow its pride and go back to the drawing board and start again. That's actually what needs to happen. And all of this is based on a false premise of a budget emergency that we all ought to measure by the paid parental leave scheme, which is in this budget, and we'll see $50,000 cheques paid to millionaires. And I know that Steve and his colleagues within the Liberal Party room hate this whole idea. But the Prime Minister has stuck with it like grim death, and he needs to abandon it because it utterly undermines the entire policy of the government.
It sounds like the government is open to compromise, much more open than it has been in previous months, with comments from Mr Pyne, the Education Minister, and also Peter Dutton on their respective portfolios. Is it time now for the Prime Minister to do the same when it comes to his signature policy, Steve Ciobo?
You know, Kieran, the great con that we hear from the Labor Party about all of this, and this is all you ever hear from Richard Marles or Bill Shorten or any of the Labor luminaries, is they just keep saying, oh, the paid parental leave scheme giving cheques to millionaires. But the falseness of it is this, Kieran. Labor is proposing more than $40 billion of additional spending going back into the budget. Now, the paid parental leave scheme is less than $5 billion, and what's more, it's fully funded. So I want to know, off the Labor Party, where are they miraculously finding the other $35 or more billion? Because Labor's fundamental problem is this. They talk the talk, but they can't walk the walk because they can't manage the Australian economy in a way that's, one, sustainable, or two, the simple fact is that Labor is happy to put Australian kids in more debt, to mortgage their futures, to pay to try to be popular now. And it's an absolute disgrace and an indictment on the Labor Party's approach.
Richard Marles, we have less than a minute to go, but I just do want to get your thoughts on the fact that if the coalition is constructive, does compromise, gets most of the measures through, it's going to look like it's had another win there, isn't it?
Well, the government needs to go back to the drawing board on the paid parental leave scheme. They just need to dump that. They need to do the same with the GP co-payment. They need to do the same with university reform. They need to do the same with the pensions. It's as simple as that. This is a dog of a budget. The government know it. They're in a world of pain around it, and they should start again.
We're out of time. Richard Marles, Steve Ciobo, gents, have a good day. Thanks for your company.
Thanks, Kieran.
Thank you.
A quick break on AM Agenda, back in just a moment.